In the last chapter, we talked about judgment and decision making under high consumer effort. This chapter focuses more on judgment and decision making under low consumer effort. These two distinct approaches correspond generally with Danny Kahneman's two approaches to thinking and decision making. And he's an important guy because he won a Nobel Prize for this kind of idea. So you can see here a quick overview. System 1 is very fast, it's intuitive, it's where we make our everyday impulse decisions. Whereas System 2 is more slow and effortful and conscious. These are decisions that are typically characterized by higher degrees of risk. Remember, thinking back to the early part of the semester, high financial risk, high physical risk. And you can learn more about this type of decision making over here on Danny Kahneman's website. It goes into more detail about fast and slow thinking. He even wrote a book on this, and I'd actually highly recommend reading it. It's a popular press book, kind of like the Cialdini book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And so you can see that fast, unconscious, automatic thinking makes up about 98% of all of our thinking. So this is the way we operate most of the time. On the other hand, System 2 is slow and effortful, and people are self-aware, but it's only really about 2% of our thinking. So it's obviously important to understand System 2 thinking because it's under this process where people make very costly decisions, things like buying a car, like I mentioned just a minute ago, but it's also important to understand System 1, because this is where we spend most of our lives. Anyway, like I said, in case you're interested in reading more about it, I've linked this page on our Canvas site. But let's come back over here and think a little bit more about some of the forces that impact what we do under System 1 thinking. So everything else I'm going to talk about now happens under System 1. Okay, so under System 1, we rely on simplifying strategies called heuristics. That's a fancy word for rule of thumb or shortcut. In the Cialdini book, all of these different rules like liking and reciprocity, commitment and consistency rely on these types of shortcuts. They're just different types of shortcut rules. Habit is another important shortcut that we use to simplify our lives. So much of our daily existence is simplified by habit. We have our routines. We eat the same thing, we buy groceries at the grocery store, and there's an estimated 45% of our daily behavior that is habitual. So this is actually really important because if we had to think every time about which route to take to the grocery store or where to park, that would impose a cognitive load that would take us away from our ability to focus on other things. So in a marketing context for low involvement products like toothpaste, consumers keep buying the same one over and over and over again without giving too much thought to the decision as long as they don't feel dissatisfied, so that there's something that prompts people away from the initial habit. So marketers invest substantial effort into getting people to form habits because you can see how this is a gold mine. Once people form the habit, they continue on and on with it until something breaks that loop. So it's also important for marketers to understand when new habits are formed. And this happens during periods of transition. So think about yourself. When maybe you were moving, coming to college, you had to find a new place to live. And you might have formed a series of new habits, or maybe when you moved with your family when you were young and had to find new stores, and consequently, new purchase patterns emerge. So take a minute now, go ahead and pause this video and watch the video below. This is an author, Chuck Duhigg, who wrote a book about the power of habit. So after you've watched this video, you can see that this is a bit of a cautionary tale about how marketers can use their understanding of consumer patterns to influence our habits outside of our conscious awareness. But it's still a powerful example of when people are in states of flux, for instance, when they're about to have a baby or when people get married. These are prime contexts in which marketers can reach out and try to form relationships with consumers because they're more likely to create habits in those times. Okay, now let's think about something a little bit different. Have you ever been shopping and put something in your cart just to think about it? You weren't sure if you were going to buy it, but you just wanted to walk around with it for a bit to see if you'd change your mind. Did you end up putting it back or buying it after all? Well, if the endowment effect is working on you, it turns out that the intent to own or owning an item can create emotional bonds that people don't want to break. So this effect says that ownership, or the intent to own, has an effect on the way that people value things. So this effect has been documented with bottles of wine, mugs and pins, even lottery tickets and housing prices. An everyday example of the endowment effect happens when people sell their homes. Often they overestimate how much the house is worth because they're emotionally invested in it. Here's another example that you might find interesting. Professor Dan Ariely described this effect through the lens of Duke University basketball. And if you're unfamiliar with Duke basketball, all you need to know that the Duke-UNC game is the biggest of the year and that it takes place in an area of the U.S. where basketball is a religion. To score tickets to the big game, students camp out for weeks. They then enter a lottery for a chance to win the tickets. The professor reached out to students who'd won tickets and those who'd entered the lottery but who didn't win. Both had invested the same amount of pain, time, and effort to enter the lottery, but some had won and others hadn't. So the question is, would ownership affect how much students thought the tickets were worth? And the results were interesting. Students who lost the lottery said they'd pay an average of $170 for a ticket. But students who won the lottery and already owned the ticket asked for 170% more for the same ticket. Basically, the lottery winners overvalued their tickets because they were more emotionally attached to them. And so the lesson is that the more emotions are associated with the product, the more people value it. Now, this is system one thinking, right? We can see that this is not logical here. If we rationally think about the market value of something, our emotions shouldn't play in, but they do. We oftentimes see marketers trying to leverage the endowment effect by offering people the opportunity to drive a car and test drive it and imagine how they feel in it, hoping that they'll form that emotional connection to the product. Framing is another form of bias or heuristic or effect on our decision making that happens when our decision is influenced by the way that information is presented. So we can take equivalent information, but present it in slightly different ways that will shape our decisions. So let's look at this as a positive frame. Would you be willing to support a program that saves 200 lives out of 600 people? Or there's a 33% chance of saving all 600 and a 66% possibility of saving no one. You know that because of the way that we think about statistics and probability, if you multiply 33 by 600, you get saves 200 lives. So this is functionally equivalent. Well, it turns out that when people are presented with this option framed positively, people are more likely to go with program A. They're more likely to want the certain win. However, if you flip it to the negative, people are more likely to be risk-seeking. They're more likely to pick program B. So a 33% chance that no people will die and a 66% probability that all 600 people will die versus a certain thing that 400 people will die. There's something about negativity or loss that makes people risk-seeking, whereas framing things positively makes people risk-averse. And we can see that with how products are framed in a marketing context. So framing ice cream as 10% fat versus, 10% fat-free versus 90% fat, or vice versa, will make a difference. And if you want to learn a little bit more about the framing effect, you can come over here to this video on YouTube. And watch how brands use framing to influence consumers. This is an interesting but not required video. And then similar, the decoy effect is related to, again, how information is presented. But it has to do with adding an option to a set that nobody finds attractive. So looking at this decision here, we see between $10 and $30 bottles of wine, the $30 bottle might seem a little bit more expensive, prompting people to be more likely to select the $10 bottle. However, if you add what is known as a decoy product to the mix, a $50 bottle of wine, the $30 bottle seems more reasonable. So thinking about this from a product assortment perspective, marketers might add products to their inventory that they're not intending to sell, but they focus people's attention on the products that are possibly higher profit margin that they do want to sell. And if you'd like to learn a little bit more about this, I have also embedded here another YouTube video on the decoy effect. So this is another interesting video. If you're interested in watching, go ahead and pause this current video and navigate over to that link. And then the last thing I'd like to mention, this is, again, just another example of how we can be influenced under System 1 thinking. The way that pricing information is presented can influence our decisions. So the rule of 100 claims that under values of 100, percentage discounts seem larger than absolute dollar value ones. But then when you get over $100, or sorry, the number 100, things are different. They reverse. So the absolute discounts, the objective amount, seem larger than the percentage ones. And so you might be saying, what does that mean? Let's look at an example here. So if we have something that is a sweater for sale for that's originally $25 and it's on sale for $15, how should we frame this discount? According to the rule of 100, we should frame it as 40% off because this number is larger than $10 off. But if we're selling a sweater for $2,500, that's quite a nice sweater there, and we've got it on sale for $2,250, we can see that this is $250 of a discount, but a mere 10% off. So the percentage reduction is lower than the absolute amount and is over 100. So in this case, we should go with $250 as the frame to use when we're talking about our promotion. So again, pricing information, the decoy effect, the framing effect, the endowment effect, these are all just different effects that prey on the biases that we have when we're operating under Route 1 or System 1 thinking, where we're not thinking very effortfully, where we're thinking very intuitively. So I share this with you in part because this information can be leveraged in your role as marketers, but also when you're operating as a consumer, you might think a little bit more about the decision context and whether it's been set up in a way, framed in a way, to try to influence your decision.